Professor Shain, please.
Thank you. It's always good to see where do they get your bio, if it's updated or not. I'm no longer the head of the Hartog School of Government for many years, but I guess
that's what I was provided.
I never said you should know. I'm just like,
That's it. It's on the internet. That's the problem.
that's it. But all the claims to fame are no longer valid. So but I'm grateful for. Sorry. I said all the claims to fame are no longer valid, but I'm very grateful for the introduction. And I got a phone call from my colleague Ephraim Inbar a few weeks ago and said, would you come to speak? And I never say no to Ephraim. And then a few weeks after, he said, I gave you this title, is that okay? So I said, whatever you want, you know, it's a title. And the title he gave to my talk is America in Decline in the Middle East. And then it forced me to think about the question that he posed to me. And we already heard from Elliot, and I think some of the comments I'll make today are in line with your comments, Elliot. And I will already kind of like go to the end of them in many ways. And I will say two things. I will argue that America's in decline is a big question. And it relates to many issues that you describe. And as you suggested, I just came back from Washington and I visited my good friend Bob Lieber, who gave me his book, which I read on the airplane. And it's a very good book. And there is kind of like a big debate about American decline. And there's kind of like the question that Lieber discusses at length on all the issues related to wallet and will, what he calls the ability of America to be engaged. The very essence of America is overstretched or not overstretched in international relations. And the very essence of America really to retain its power in the world altogether. And in particular, of course, in our case, in the Middle East. And this is a big issue. We can discuss it, and we see to what extent American capacities in the Middle East are really still there. Especially in light, as you suggested also, of the, I would say, difficult times, if I'm in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the very essence of what the American goal is altogether. What really America wants. To what extent America's influence should be measured. What does it mean even to be influential? Or is this engagement is really yielding any benefits? Can you really bear the fruits of that? What does it mean? So this is one big question that you want to ask when you come to my question. The second question, of course, and it is a related question, and I think you alluded to it, but I want to elaborate on it more, is in this line of thought, to what extent the Middle East is in decline. To what extent, when we come to the question of American decline in the Middle East, as the question was posed to me by my colleague, Professor Inbar, what the Middle East can yield, what kind of fruits can come from the Middle East, especially in light of what we are seeing today, that of course will resonate for many, many years to come. I've no doubt that some of us will be already in retirement, I certainly will be, and we will study the Middle East and we will say, you know, these last 2 years that we are now witnessing have changed the Middle East dramatically. And the very big question will be, what will remain of it? In addition, of course, to the question that you have raised about American capacity, the question of oil, the question of Islam, the question of Europe, etc. All those are huge questions that we always have to be careful about making predictions, but nevertheless, trajectories, as you suggested, are there, and especially in light of what is happening in the Middle East. And perhaps we want to go back and see what has happened in the United States vis-à-vis the Middle East, in what respect the United States was in fact a major power in the Middle East all these years, in the last 5 or 6 decades. And I would say mostly the United States appear on the scene of the Middle East, of course, in full force only after the Sinai War. In that respect, kind of, this is the time America is starting to appear. And maybe after 1973, as we know, the United States is finally kind of coming of age in the Middle East and becoming a major, major, major player. And what has happened here is to what extent the United States really have all those issues that were engaged with the United States as a superpower, as a beacon of values, as the only player against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and later on as the ultimate power in the Middle East, to what extent these issues are at all relevant, let alone to what extent the United States can generate such engagement as it could once all these issues were at the fore. This is a very important question, and I'm not going to have many answers, but certainly one can ask this question and start to raise them. So let's begin by saying that the United States, in some respect, entered the Middle East perhaps in the full scale during a very peculiar time, which is the time of the dawn era of the other Western power. And this kind of emergence of the United States will raise many questions at the time in the Arab mind and in the Arab world, which also was entering a period of what later on we'll know as the transformation, the first transformation of the Arab world as we saw it into radical, sort of like the radicalism, or what we call the Arab radicals, or the regime that was supposed to transform Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, etc., the new Arab regimes. This was the time, the early 50s. At the early 50s, America was still perceived in the Middle East as something of a certain nature that is not necessarily a Western power as it later will be perceived as something which will be, I would say, create hostility toward America as part of the West. Let me quote Hasnin Haikal at the early part of the 50s, when he kind of considered the United States as when the new regime of free officers, we are now coming full circle perhaps today, but the new regime of free officers coming to be, and Hasnin Haikal is writing, and let me quote what he writes. He writes, and this is after years in his biography, he writes, "The whole future of the United States at the time was a glamorous one. Britain and France were fading, hated empires. The Soviet Union was 5,000 miles away, and the ideology of communism was anathema to Muslim religion. But America had emerged from World War II richer, more powerful, and more appealing than ever. Refrigerators, television, and the instruments of new life seems to be common for America. So the United States wore an aura of success and glamour, shining out above the tarnished failure of the old imperialists, and people were receptive to the idea of Americans playing a major role in the Middle East." That's how they saw it. Basically seeing the United States not just as kind of an enemy, as people used to depict the West altogether, the whole idea of Orientalism, which became so much pronounced later on in Edward Said thesis, but even prior to that. But rather perhaps the United States is giving something else. But this something else very quickly ran counter to the ideology that becoming enshrined in the Middle East. The ideology that kind of combined nationalism and socialism and became imbued with Soviet expansion into the Middle East as well. So while the initial entry of the United States into the Middle East, you had kind of like a receptive ear, and the United States immediately was trying to subvert it, one can argue, into the Baghdad Pact, trying to make kind of like to cash in into this. Very quickly the United States was becoming kind of like on the other side of the aisle. It became not only because of its relations with Israel, which were not so developed, but because the United States was seen as an imperial force by the radicals, as they were coming only to the scene. And the radicals coming to the scene in the 50s and the 60s started to create what Ajami described at the time, the schizophrenic relations with the United States. On the one hand, there was this great admiration and the usage of all kind of values that at least were pronounced rhetorically, and on the other hand, it's kind of like the fear and also anger at the United States that it's not coming to the help of the Arabs, that it's not part of the Arab story, which the Arab story at the time was kind of like the recreation of nationalism, the recreation of an egalitarian society, at least rhetorically, and the recreation of our stage in the world, in world affairs. The United States at the time was not seen to be kind of sharing this vision. And this vision gradually became, in that respect, a way of enmity that was geared to the United States. But the story of Arab radicalism didn't end there. And the story of the United States, of course, didn't end there as well. The United States did develop alliances in the Middle East, as we all know. It developed alliances with Saudi Arabia. It developed alliances with Transjordan. It developed alliances, of course, with the Iranians. And they were all seen by the radicals to be hostile to their causes. So the United States was on the other side of the aisle, let alone, of course, with the issue of Israel. The issue of Israel, which will come to the fore much more after 1967. Then we come into a different posture. And the different posture is this kind of like the decline of some sorts of Arab radicalism in terms of the pronouncements and in terms of the behavior. This will be in light of the 1973 war, and of course I don't do justice to this evolution, but this is kind of like an attempt to summarize it to some extent in the minutes that I have. And in 1973 what we have is really the entry of the United States into the Middle East in full force. And its entry was because it was facilitated in 1973 as a way of invited by the Egyptians after the Egyptians are kicking out the Soviets. This was a big transformation. The Egyptians, as you all know, were going alone eventually to Camp David. But inviting the United States with the Saudis, and the United States will have to deliver only one thing. It will have to deliver the Palestinians eventually. That was the idea. Just deliver the Palestinians and we can justify our alliance with the United States. This was also Anwar Sadat kind of creed. Fuad Ajami, in his brilliant book, as you're all familiar with, on the Arab predicament, has written and he writes, for a while, post-October 1973, American structure in the Middle East looked awesome indeed, based on the alliance with the regime in Riyadh, Tehran, Cairo, and Jerusalem, and the acquiescence of the one in Damascus. It suggested the possibility of taming the region's conflict, containing the Soviet Union, and keeping the castrated Europe dependent on the United States. This was a really new stature in the United States. America could see no enemy. America was the only play in town. This was at the time when the Soviet Union was starting to declining in the Middle East, and eventually declining, of course, as a result of Afghanistan. You have alluded to the fact that at the time, discussion in the United States was about American own decline as a result of the economy under Jimmy Carter, and of course the debacle that was ensued in Iran. But nevertheless, the very essence of American presence was becoming very, very dominant, let alone, of course, its alliance with Israel, which was at that time was shaped and was nourished, and as Tzvi knows very well, this was the heyday, kind of like finally, sort of America and Israel were in bed together after many years that America was quite reluctant to take Israel as its kind of to chaperone Israel's cause. This was really the essence of the alliance after the Kissinger role in the Middle East, the Nixon era, and we are moving into the Camp David era. The United States is the key factor by all accounts at the time as the only one who could break the peace. And it did break the peace in some respect, of course, between Israel and, of course, the Egyptians. But the United States itself became also the issue of condemnation, the issue of, I would say, anger among the left, among those when the Palestinian issue came to the fore, and among the new radicals. As radicalism of states started to wane in the Middle East, and radicalism of movements started to appear in the early 80s, with movements starting kind of like to challenge the very essence of radical states because of their failure, the United States therefore became again identified as someone who identified much more with Israel, identified with the enemy of progress, and let alone later on identified with the enemy of Islam altogether, with the revolutionary mode in the Middle East. And yet again, as we know, all these developments coming again from nowhere as the United States becoming again the superpower because of not the Middle East, but because of somewhere else, because of the issue of the collapse of communism. The collapse of communism is so immense in that respect that it brings the United States again as the sole superpower, let alone its action in Iraq to free Kuwait. The United States is the only power. It's the omnipotent power. It's the only player, leading all the way to the Madrid conference. And the United States can do everything. It can conquer. It can use the new weapons that it invests. It was all the So in that respect, the United States, the more it become involved and the more it become engaged in the Middle East, the more expectation and the more anger toward her in that respect. The more questions are raised, how much its involvement, how deeper it should be, how much it really influenced, and above all on the issue of the Israeli and Palestinian. Everything came to the fore with the United States vis-à-vis the Arabs in terms of the inability of the United States to move Israel. This was the case. To move Israel into a solution that will enable some legitimacy to those who are still supporting the United States. This will be the case of the United States getting its act together, supposedly, after the 1993 peace agreement with the Palestinians, or the DOP, peace agreement, we call it, or whatever it is. The United States becoming deeply engaged. The United States will reshape the Middle East. Pax Americana will be prevailing. And it's all the United States' ability to deliver Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinians with all those years of the Clinton era that the United States can do all of this, and the United States will be the number one player. It can be legitimated even by the newly emerging radicals as long as the United States really will deliver the Palestinian question. That's why Arafat can be the greatest guest in the White House, and Arafat kind of like perhaps will hug all the others to accept the United States as the player. There was no other player whatsoever. Fast forward, of course, we entered, of course, the issue of the era of terror. And the era of terror, the war of terror against terror after 9/11, I don't have to tell you, you're all familiar with this, but kind of putting the United States again at odds with lots of the states, with lots of the structures. People have talked about to what extent the occupation of Iraq, the move to Afghanistan, the whole fight against the United States is the fight. No other player in the international arena is even engaged in this but the United States. Europeans can join the chorus of criticism of the United States in the early 2000s, etc. But the United States is the player. It's amazing to see that after this decade of deep engagement, suddenly the United States is moving away and becoming less and less significant. And this kind of coming full circle to my early comments. Is it because of the deep crisis the United States is facing, or is it because of the deep crisis the Middle East is facing? I would say it's both. I would say it's both. I don't want to get into the deep crisis of the United States. My friends always tell me, don't bet against America, and who am I to bet altogether? But nevertheless, it is important to remember what stage America is in. America is not in good shape. I hope America will recover, and I hope America internal capacities will show themselves once again. I doubt that there is parallel between 1979, the crisis in America, and the crisis right now, Elliot, but nevertheless, I want to remain optimist. But certainly the Middle East does not yield itself to such challenges as it did, either in 1973 or after the Camp David Accords, or of course after the DOP. Right now, the challenges of the Middle East do not show how the United States can play a role. And every role they play is kind of like conspicuous role, because you don't know how much to push and how much not to push. Can the United States interfere in Syria? How much the United States can act even in Egypt, we don't know. And of course, there are all those interests that are at stake. What remains, and this is important, are two issues. On the one hand, there are the minimalists. I just read yesterday Thomas Friedman, and Thomas Friedman is all over the place for many years for me, and I don't know what Thomas Friedman wants, but as of yesterday I can tell you what he wanted. Because I really feel Thomas Friedman kind of used to have a mission, but now he kind of like confused about America and the Middle East, perhaps together. So yesterday in his essay about the United States in the Arab world, Thomas Friedman concludes that the United States at this time, as he writes, the single most popular thing the United States could do right now is to support the Arab Spring, to identify 7 specific fields of work in light of manufacturing, textile, service, world processing, etc., and establish an education program that can impact real skills in those jobs, rather than go after number 2 of Al-Qaeda. That's the only thing that the United States can do. Support education system. Beautiful. That's the United States. It will support some education system. And we know whenever America trying to support education system, immediately they blame them for bringing some bad American ideals to the madrasas. But if this is a minimum issue. But the big issue remains, and I think again you're right, Elliot. The big issue remains what the United States will do vis-a-vis Iran. This is the only test in town, and perhaps it is the test. Because if indeed the United States will manage to curtail the Iranian threat, so the United States certainly showed itself to be, again, the only player in town. If it will not, the question of decline will be immediately come to the fore and say, okay, the United States lost the big question, the proliferation, the nuclear proliferation. There will be, it's not a matter of ideas anymore the United States doesn't try to shape. It's not, with all due respect, Condi Rice running between Iraq, the Hezbollah and Gaza telling us, wow, 3 democracies were just established. America doesn't come with any ideas anymore. America taking a back seat. America is kind of cannot do it because of wallet and because of will, perhaps. But America still have to deliver the Iranian case. And this, I think, will be the test of the future. The test of the future remains because the rhetoric is incredibly heightened. I don't want to get into this issue because I'm one of those who does not understand. While everybody understands the nuclear issue, I really don't. And I make this pronouncement to really make it clear that I don't. But assuming that this is the issue, as everybody tells us, so certainly this is the test. And since everybody climbed this ladder and climbed these trees, certainly we have to deal with this. I think this will basically be how to shape the future. But having said all of this, and this will be my final comment, we know that the Middle East itself has this tendency to surprise not only the Israelis and others, but the United States as well. And the United States, from time to time, is forced to get engaged in places which perhaps it didn't even think it will have to be before. I don't think the United States was planning to get engaged in Iraq or in Afghanistan. I don't think the United States was planning to get engaged in Lebanon in 1983, where it lost 241 Marines in one day in the barracks. So sometimes the Middle East kind of is drawing the United States into interventions. And why the America is going to interventions and why not, it's a big question that you were asking, Tzvi, at the beginning. Does a really this sort of engagement yield any fruit for the United States? But this is, of course, all a matter of a speculation. So right now, as I said, there is 2 tendencies that exist. The decline of the Middle East in terms of like what the Middle East was all about. And I think, I wouldn't like to call it the decline of America, but certainly America, the entrenchment issue is there. How much America should kind of like use a different size of intervention, overstretched issue is there, and certainly what the Middle East will yield, and finally, of course, the Iranian issue, which is looming out there to really to shape all these questions altogether. I thank you for your attention.